My name is Shannon Chamberlain, and my documentary is titled The Italian Woman and the Huguenots. Catherine de' Medici, daughter of Lorenzo de' Medici, is considered to be one of the bravest, strongest, most influential women in Europe during the 1500s, as she would have a lasting impact on the history of France forever. Both her parents died soon after her birth, but young Catherine would be raised by a distant relative, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici. At the age of 14, Pope Clement VII marries Catherine to Henry of Orleans, the second eldest son of the king. Once married to Henry of Orleans, who would become King Henry II of France, she had to deal with the presence of a mistress by the name of Diane de Poitiers. Henry II was weak-minded, causing Diane de Poitiers, as Catherine called her, the old prostitute, to have an influential power over French politics, a fact that Catherine despised. Once Catherine had her first child with the king, her position augmented. Her husband would die in a jousting tournament, leading to their eldest son, Francis II, to take the throne. She was said to be in grief for the rest of her life, dressing in black. Her emphasis on black clothing can be seen in various portraits of her, such as painted by Clouet. Francis II too was weak-minded and only ruled for 17 months before his death. This led to her second son, Charles IX, to rise to the throne at a mere 10 years old. Becoming a regent for her son, Catherine was finally able to have a stronger hold over France. Catherine was a proud mother and cared deeply for her children. As her letters indicate, she carefully utilized her motherly authority to further her political role. This helped her rule alongside her sons in an extremely prominent manner. First, Catherine took a conciliatory policy towards the Huguenots as advised by L'Hôpital. Thus, one reason for her conciliatory policy was simply due to the Catholic leaders of Spain essentially threatening and bullying her and her family, while Protestant leaders showed the utmost respect for her and her family in court. One such leader was Admiral Coligny, who showed devout kindness to Catherine de' Medici. Conciliatory policy was not easy, however, with the Catholic public vehemently protesting the Protestant faith. One of her many attempts at a peaceful solution was the Edict of January. This edict recognized and legalized the Protestant faith in France, which had been officially outlawed previously. By giving the Protestants recognition, she established their citizenship, even if it was a second-class citizenship. They would be permitted to practice their religion, but only outside town walls. Parliament refused to ratify the document, and as predicted, Catholics were furious. Spain promised to be hostile and bitter to France if they refused to rescind this edict. Eventually, the edict was passed, but it only evoked bitterness from both parties. Tensions were furthered in 1562 when the Duke of Guise overheard a Protestant mass within a barn inside town walls, a violation of the edict. A fight then broke out in which 74 Protestants were killed and over 100 individuals wounded. Women and children were numbered in the casualties as well. This massacre of the sea is said to have initiated the sparks of the French Wars of Religion. The Duke of Guise would lead the Catholic side of the First French War of Religion, and Condé and Coligny would lead the Protestant side. The Guise family soon after claimed the Huguenots were trying to capture the royal family, and despite protests, Catherine was forced to go with the Guises and their cavalry along with her family. She knew this plot of moving them would lead to the side of the Guises becoming in possession of the law. Remorseful at tending the troops to battle the Huguenots, she even kissed the opposite leader, Condé, on the mouth. She still radiated a desire for peace and compromise between the two, not a full-out war in France. She constantly advocated peace talks, but the people were against her, and thus the Guise family continued to move forward after each pivotal battle. After the death of the Duke of Guise, Catherine became by default chief of the Catholic Party. Realizing that the majority of her people were Catholic, she now had to take a policy that would prevent the spread of the Reformed religion. Despite these pressures, she still took the compromise at the peace talks, which resulted in the Edict of Amboise. This document allowed Huguenots to think freely and worship inside their homes. Neither of the two parties were satisfied, however, and general dissatisfaction ensued. She still tried to maintain peace between the two parties by throwing balls and attractions within the court that joined both Huguenots and Catholics together. She even entertained Condé, one of the heads of the Huguenots, as a guest for the feast of Corpus Christi. She hoped these policies would prevent the sides from killing one another. What led Catherine de' Medici to change her position on the idea of peace and compromise between the two religions? For starters, once the First War of Religion had ended, Catherine was flooded with complaints from Coligny, and she declared that if the Protestants continued to break the law, she would retaliate without respect to persons or religion or any other consideration but the peace of this state. Thus started the beginning of descent for Catherine into feelings of vengeance for the Protestant party. Protestants also began to attack Catholics out of fear that during 1567, Catherine and the Spanish were plotting with a secret plan to raise troops against them. One attack even involved the killing of monks, and Catherine began to take a cooler view of the Protestants, saying that their actions were no better than that of the Turks. This fear grew out of counter-rumors that soon built up to such an extreme paranoia that the Protestants planned to kidnap Catherine de' Medici and her son Charles IX. Catherine de' Medici's main concern was always for her sons. Thus, the surprise de Meaux, or the plot to kidnap the royal family at Meaux, was one of the strongest influences in Catherine de' Medici's end of conciliatory policy, as well as a spark to the Second French War of Religion. Frustrated by the successful escape of the royal family from their plot, the Protestants began to plan to besiege Paris. Condé made religious demands but also established a personal attack against Catherine by claiming the French women and men were suffering and paying for the greed of foreigners and Italians during peacetime, which was meant to reference Catherine's excessive expenditure in the court. Her court was famous for its luxury, as the memoirs of her daughter Margaret show the kind of elegant clothing worn at court, as well as the ornate activities that took place, such as dancing. This ad hominem was the last straw for Catherine. Upon meeting at the King's Council, Catherine officially ended her conciliatory policy towards the Huguenots, in which she stated that she needed to combat their unprovoked treason, which in turn was deemed the greatest wickedness in the world. The days of an enlightened, tranquil Catherine were now gone. An army was built up by the king and Catherine, as well as a counter-army by Condé and Coligny. Catherine attempted to formulate a secret plan in 1568 with the rebel representative Chatillon in order to end the war. The secret plan was leaked, and Parisians were astounded that the queen was willing to compromise with the rebels when they themselves were squeezed for taxes to support the army. A scuffle occurred between officers and Parisian protesters as a result. Despite the cold winters of 1567 to 1568, the Huguenots made considerable advances. Condé managed to lay siege to Chartres. However, his campaign stopped there due to a lack of funds and supplies. Charles was upset at the incompetence of his brother Francis, who was put in charge of the royal army, and Charles demanded that he himself be put in charge of the army, but Catherine forbade to put her son in such a position of danger. After Condé was unable to complete his campaign, and due to frustration on both sides, peace talks were achieved, and the Peace of Langevin was signed in the March of 1568. As usual, the peace treaty was unfavorable to both sides, and violence continued to break out. The Edict of Amboise was reinstated, and the Huguenots were ordered to return the lands they stole in the war. However, the Huguenots refused to return these lands, and Catholics continued to kill Huguenots. The sides were once again close to war. Conflict would continue between the Protestants and Catholics until the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1570, which closely modeled the Peace of Amboise in 1563. Freedom of worship was granted to the Huguenots, but restriction was placed on the locations. There would be no restriction in terms of universities or hospitals based on religion, either Catholic or Protestant, as one would assume. However, grumbling continued on both sides. The treaty itself was mainly created from exhaustion. Catherine soon learned that trying to create compromise on both sides only led to further conflict, resulting in a vicious, non-stop cycle. Catherine was forced to take drastic measures to protect her son's throne and the peace of the state. Coligny continued to cause trouble as he continued to promote war with Spain in the early 1570s. The rising of troops against the decision of the council contributed to the frenzy to kill him, as she knew that he would be soon to leave Paris, and thus we have St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It all began with the arranged marriage of Catherine's daughter Margot to Henry of Navarre. This marriage, as Catherine suspected, brought many Huguenots to the city of Paris. Allowing the Guise family to finally take revenge, and they were definitely prepared to do so, both families worked together to devise a plot to kill Coligny. By August of 1572, Paris was filled with religious and political tension. Upon first arrival, the Huguenots were treated peacefully. After a few weeks, however, tensions began to arise as Catholics became disgusted at the idea of said marriage. The stage was set for violence and chaos. On the last day of celebrations, the attempt on Coligny's life was a failure. As a result, another plot occurred the following day on August 23rd, in order to preserve both the safety of the king and of Catherine. Coligny was beat and thrown out of a window as Huguenots lodged in the Louvre too saw killing begin. Dragged from their beds, their throats were cut, and many were chased into the courtyard of the Louvre. Their screams were said to have echoed within the great halls of the art-filled palace. Few were spared from the ghastly attack, and this is why Catherine de' Medici is forever known as the Black Queen. A little over a decade later, on the morning of January 5th, 1589, Catherine de' Medici made her last testament. Slowly losing her ability to breathe, she died later that afternoon at the age of 69. Her funeral took place on February 4th, and her last child alive, Margot, died in 1615. Thus was the perish of the Valois dynasty. Striving for compromise but having to handle copious amounts of conflict, the Renaissance Queen of France leaves behind a country that would take many years to see peace.